This lecture is all about providing you with a high-level overview of Canadian cropping systems. How they've changed over time and currently, how they're different across the country. All right, so let's start with some historical data. This is data from the Canadian Farm Census. It's run by Statistics Canada, and they survey basically every single Canadian farmer. And so the latest census was done in 2016, so this is the data I'm presenting. A couple of things to note here. One is the farm to total ratio, which is the ratio of Canadians living on farms directly involved in agriculture versus the total number of Canadians living in Canada. And between 1931 and 2016, it's declined from 1 in 3, or 33%, to 1 in 50, or 2%. Okay, so there's a lot less Canadians involved in agriculture, and yet food production has just continued to increase. And we've talked a little bit about why previously. The other thing to notice is that while the number of farms in Canada has declined, the average farm size, the number of acres, the number of acres that an individual farmer or farm family are managing has increased from 224 to 820 acres. So average farm size has increased quite dramatically while the total farm population and the number of farms has continued to decline. And indeed, total food production, which is not shown here, total agricultural production has increased quite a bit. So I think there's two important broad trends to consider thinking about how Canadian cropping systems have changed over the past 90 to 100 years. One broad trend is the decline in crop livestock integration. Okay, so back then it was much more common than it is today to have both crop production and livestock production occurring on the same farm. Crop livestock integration provided a number of synergies that were especially important in earlier times. And I'll just give you three examples. Number one is manure. So manure was the source of plant nutrients prior to inorganic fertilizers. And, all farmers across the world use manure to fertilize their crops. The problem is manure is very heavy. It's primarily water or dry matter that does not have a nutrient value. And so shipping manure, off farm is expensive. It's not really economical to move manure more than a dozen or so kilometers away. And so there was a huge benefit to having manure production on your farm. And so that's what farmers did with crop livestock integration. The next would be value add. Okay, so farmers could grow a crop like corn, and instead of selling their corn on the market, they could feed it to some chickens and then sell those chicken eggs. And so crop livestock integration was and still is a way to value add your crop production by feeding your crops to your livestock and then selling the livestock products. The next is forages. This was especially true before tile drainage became increasingly common and land leveling, but there were many pieces of land that could not support arable crop production or annual crop production, something like wheat or barley or corn or soybeans. And so instead of trying to till or grow an annual crop, it was more common to just use forages, either a natural pasture or a managed improved pasture. And so having livestock on farm allowed a farmer to monetize that land, get value from that land that they couldn't plant an annual crop from, because of course ruminants would graze that forage and convert it into something that the farmer could sell, something of value. Another broad change in Canadian cropping systems from the 1930s to today was a simplification of crop rotations. And again, crop rotation is the sequence of crops over time, year after year, grown on an individual field. And in the past, crop rotations were much more diverse. They included a wider range of crops. Okay, and there was a number of reasons for that. Number one, farms typically had smaller fields, and that meant that they could rotate multiple crops in the same year. Now, what do I mean by risk mitigation, and how does crop rotation influence that? Well, this was again back in the day before synthetic herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. And so it was entirely possible if you grew only one crop that you could get, whatever, a disease or an insect pest come and destroy everything. And so to avoid that, to minimize the risk of a complete crop failure, one would grow different kinds of crops, right? Because if a disease wiped out most of your corn, well, you had other crops that could provide you with, a means to make a living. Okay, it was also important to spread out labor requirements over the season, okay, because different crops, for example, are harvested at different times. And again, before, in the 1930s, mechanization was not as common. And so it was just more labor intensive to, for example, harvest a crop. And so if you could have one crop, such as, say, winter wheat, that you could harvest in mid-July or towards the end of July. If you had a crop like oats that you could harvest towards the end of August, a crop like soybeans, which you could harvest towards the end of September, a crop like corn, you could harvest towards the end of October. You get the picture. If you can spread out those labor requirements, that's what's necessary, again, if you are not mechanized, right? You don't have a gigantic machine that allows you to harvest multiple acres an hour, which farmers in the 1930s did not. So more diverse rotations were also important for nutrient supply and weed management. So again, before synthetic fertilizers, growing legumes which provided residual nitrogen to the next crop, growing something like an alfalfa forage or something like clover, red clover, that would allow you, the next crop that was grown after, to have more nitrogen and therefore higher yields. And again, also, just for weed management, again, before herbicides, crop rotation allowed farmers to more effectively deal with weeds. So the drivers of this trend towards larger farm sizes in Canada, indeed also in the United States and many other parts of the world, are quite numerous, right? And they include reasons like mechanization, just the fact that, we have larger tractors, larger tillage equipment and harvest equipment, and so an individual farmer or farm family can manage more land, right? That's one obvious reason compared to the 1930s. And there's a number of economic reasons, right? The ability to, for example, spread out capital costs across a larger land base. Okay, so there's a number of reasons why farms are getting larger and larger, and they're economic as well as technological, but they're beyond largely the scope of this course. The simplification of crop rotations is driven by a number of factors. So before synthetic herbicides and fertilizers were commercially available, crop rotation was a major tool in the toolbox that farmers used to deal with different weeds and to provide soil fertility, or to increase soil fertility or plant nutrient availability to their crops. For example, by rotating legumes with cereals, and then also including a couple of years of forages. Specialization and separation of crop and livestock production. Again, if you don't have livestock on farm, what would be the point necessarily of growing forages? Something like 3 or 4 years of forages. There's not a huge economic reason to do that. In Ontario, I will mention one exception, which is the horse hay production. So farms in Ontario will grow hay almost as a cash crop. High quality hay, they'll sell it to markets, for example, in Florida, where there's a lot of racehorses, or elsewhere, across Canada. But other than that, not a huge reason to include a couple years of forages if you don't have livestock. Economies of scale and investment. If you're going to buy a very expensive piece of machinery that's great at only doing something for corn, or an expensive piece of machinery that you only use for soybeans, well, then there's a huge incentive to keep that crop prevalent in the rotation. And so there's economies of scale with especially more expensive pieces of equipment to having simpler rotations. Government programs like the fuel ethanol mandate, which really drives the demand for corn in this province, that is also going to influence rotations just because of market demand. Another example of that is oats. Right in the 1920s, about 25% of all acreage in North America was dedicated to growing oats because there were a lot of horses. Okay, then comes Henry Ford with the Model T car, and we have mechanization, John Deere, and then there's not that many more. There's not as many horses, and so we don't have that many oats being grown in the province. Maybe 1% of the land is grown to oats now, like 100,000 acres maybe. Next thing I want to mention is the percentage of rented land. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the agronomy of crop rotation, but overall, crop rotations offer long-term soil benefits, okay, in terms of soil fertility, soil structure, and that long-term benefit is not going to be realized if you're just renting land. And so as more and more farmers are renting land as opposed to owning land, or as more of their farm is comprised of rented land, the incentive to have a complex crop rotation for those long-term benefits, those soil benefits, it's just not there because the owner of that land can just decide not to rent to them anymore. And that was important for risk mitigation